In this module, we are going to discuss about disaster management in India as well as in other countries. How do they follow? What techniques do they follow for overcoming this disaster problematics and the loss which they suffered because of this disaster? While in the course, we are gonna start with first basic introduction, which is very useful and which gives a greater understanding of disaster management for an individual, and we will further proceed with types of disasters, and we will also proceed with vulnerability profile of India, which help us to locate the locations in India where the area which is prone to disasters. And we are going to discuss the main object, that is disaster management cycle, and how does that follow in India. And we are going to discuss about the framework of various countries which we adopted for a better disaster management program. And we are going to discuss about in detail concept of disaster management in India, how do we tackle disaster problems. And we are going to discuss Disaster Management Act of 2005, which help us to understand all the laws which are related to this disaster management. And we are going to discuss about disaster management architecture and various institutions which are responsible for tackling the problems of disasters. And we are going to discuss about the case studies also, which will be very helpful for in greater understanding of the in detail concept of this subject. And first of all, we are going to start with a basic introduction, what is a disaster and how it affects our economy or everything or human life or loss. First, get started with this disaster. The meaning of disaster is nothing but a calamity or a catastrophe that can cause a huge damage for human life, not only human life but also to property also. If we basically move into the concept of this disaster, it is an instantaneous event, or which results or which ends in causing enormous damage to human life, and even not only human life but also to property as well, public property and economic private property. And it also results in economic loss to the nation, while it stops all the day functionings of that area, particular area which is affected by with this disaster. And there will be a huge loss for environment loss also, and this takes many years to restore everything uh, for the affected areas. And generally we have many areas in India which are generally prone to some disasters. Generally, a disaster is a short, instantaneous event which happens over a very short period of time. But the damage which is caused with this disaster will be a very long time effect, and which causes enormous damage for human life and very significant damage to the property also. And it also causes material damage, that is which results in infrastructural damage, and as well as damage to private property and public property as well. While if we consider the effectiveness of this disaster, it mainly aims the weaker sections of the community, and restoring them all day to day functions well. Restoring them will be a very difficult task even to the government, because it causes huge damage. So if we go in depth in this subject, disaster management, it is all about how we can tackle the disaster and how we can reduce the disaster risk reduction plans, and how to build a capacity building and prevention and mitigation of disasters, and establishing a disaster management cycle for comprehensively covering the pre and post disaster phases. Like pre is concerned with warning, early warnings, and post is concerned with restoring back as it is usual in normal days. And finally, a disaster event will result in significant damage to economic loss to a country as well as communities affected, and many people will even lose their life, and human loss has been a big issue in these disasters. And finally, a disaster can even impact on environment as well. Like, for suppose there will be an environment loss associated with many disasters, especially the biodiversity of the region. If we talk about the biodiversity of the region, that includes the flora and fauna, which is like a very endangered species also may be lost because of this disasters. And this all can be significantly affected flora and fauna with these disasters. For example, if we have any critical animal in the region, and disaster might prone a threat for this prone a threat for that endangered species of that flora and fauna. And the very and it may even cause a damage to the very existence of that species, as which may even result the environment and biodiversity of the region can be also significantly affected. If we talk about a particular damages caused by this disaster, we can take into consideration that human life has been affected, and which is irreplaceable. And even it will be a significant damage for the property, which in turn results in falling the country's GDP down. And if something has been caused, or something has been destroyed, for example industrialization industries or something, it takes a huge time for recovering all those, and for restoring all those, and which in turn that will be affected in country's GDP, fall in the country's GDP, and that in turn will affect in a huge problems for the government even to search for the funds. And this also results the this damage is not limited for public property but also to private property also. And there may be a material damage for because of this disasters, and there may be also infrastructural damage. Many infrastructures might be in a risk because of these disasters, and historical monuments will also be affected because of this disasters. And that will be in turn result in a huge loss for the countries and for the people, for the livelihood who are based on that monument. All the people who are based on the business for on that monument because of that tourist, they also will be affected because of this disasters. And major part in this disaster is that people will be misplaced because of this disasters, and that will be causing a huge loss for their family members. If we talk about the impact of this disaster, this may have impact as well as to environment as well as to economy of the country, and especially the biodiversity, which can be which can be restored back. For example, if a certain species of flora and fauna is affected because of this disaster, we can't restore them back because already that species might be endangered, or critically endangered species. And because of this disasters, even the species will be vanished. So that causes a huge damage because one of the creature is not in existence because of this disasters also. This creates a lot of loss for environment as well. And it also affects all the daily wage workers, or a medium scale or a salaried employees, because they'll be losing their jobs because of this disaster prone disasters. So not all areas will face these disasters, but areas which are affected with this disasters are more more people are facing more problems in those areas, like they are losing each and everything when this disaster occurs. And many lives has been lost. That will be an irreplaceable uh, thing which in entire thing. And even the government may give compensation, but giving compensation will not bring the lost life. So this is an major thing in this disaster management. We are going to talk about how we can tackle this disaster management disasters with this disaster management thing. And now in this slide we are going to evaluate all possible consequences of these disasters. If we evaluate in detail, there will be four possible consequences because of this disasters. So there are four consequences, possible consequences of a disaster like calamity. It results in widespread damage to human life and property, to as well as to economy and as well as to environment. And generally during these times of disaster, the eligible community to cope up with such an event will be overwhelmed, which means the community can't be able to cope up with the disaster during with their own resources. So because every possible infrastructure of the community can stand destroyed during a large scale devastation during this disasters, and the community will require some external assistance in the areas of like search and rescue operation, or in some relief also, or in some medical aid, or even some financial and technical support they require during these disasters. And that is the reason why the national and state authorities play a very vital role, a very important role in assisting the local community by giving them required sources and resources and required support for the time being during these disasters to cope up with the disaster and its consequences. So we need to talk about two things, two main points on this disaster during the disaster. So, if we talk about the two particular things or two particular impacts on the context of this disaster, the first thing will be impact of this disaster in developing countries in particular way, and the impact on of this disaster on the weaker sections of the society. So, for suppose if we consider a developing nation, if a disaster occurs in this developing nation, so that will be 20 times more impact when compared to a developed nation, when compared to a industrialized nation like USA. If any disaster happens in USA, there is no much loss for the economy. When it happens in India, that will be 20 times more of the impact of the USA. So it is an estimated that the natural disasters or a man-made disasters even can have a disappropriate impact on the developing or underdeveloping countries as well, as compared with the industrialized country. According to various estimates, like including the figures from United Nations and the World Bank and etc., it was said that the disaster can have an impact which is 20 times more, not 10 or 5. It is 20 times greater in GDP terms on a developing nation when as compared to a developed nation, that is industrialized nation. This is one of the reasons why countries like India need to build very strong effective disaster management machinery in order to cope up with the loss, or in cope up with these disasters. So we are going to discuss how this all happens and what India implemented for this. As we have already discussed the impacts of disasters on economic functions of a country and the weaker sections of a society, and so this I think this is the these two reasons, based upon these two reasons, India should build a very effective disaster management system, and it should create a system and industrial framework which will assist the affected communities immediately during these disasters. Even in India, disaster rescue operations are not that much immediate of to that disaster, so we have to improve a lot in this immediate assistance. So it also needs to mitigate the damage and provide financial and technical assistance, and we have to even ensure that the life is brought into the track as soon as possible, as soon as the we can do with our whole effects involved, and within the affected communities, and generally this will be affected the weaker sections which bears the maximum brunt of this impact of the disaster, especially those sections who are below poverty line and below above poverty line, and even the middle class families will suffer a lot, because those people who are working in private sector, or those people who are having jobs in private sectors, there will be a huge threat to their jobs, as there is no particular thing because they will be affected because of these disasters. And if we talk about the particular impact on weaker sections include to the vulnerable sections of the community. This include elderly women and children and disabled, and as well as minorities and the poor. So this segment of population will bear the maximum brunt of the disaster, and this is the reason why a developing countries like India should develop an institutional mechanism to deal with these disasters. To and Just to sum up the things, so this all results, and children will be affected because as well as their educational system is also being affected, and even the elderly women and elderly people are suffered a lot during these disasters. And if we sum up things, a disaster can have a disproportionate impact on developing countries in the terms of economy, and it may even cause huge damage for the life as well as property. And the second disaster can impact, and even this second thing if we discuss, and even this disaster can impact the weaker sections of the society, because they are the one who will be living on their wage earnings. So that will be a huge loss for them, because they'll be completely lost their employment for nearly 1 month to 2 months during this disaster times, because everything need to be restored for getting them again employed as of normal days, as of to restore the normal days. So we have to bring an effective mechanism to sort out all these problems. First of all, we are going to discuss an overview of this disaster management. So, this disaster management brought two crucial concepts in every country from the further disaster management built on. So, the first one is creation of disaster management cycle, which comprehensively cover the pre-disaster and the post-disaster, and provide the an integrated approach to combat the impacts of the disaster and to deal with the consequences of disaster. In short sense, it has made a disaster management cycle which help us to rescue the victims in the fast manner, in the as soon as it is possible with our efforts. And while coming for the second one, it broadened the concept of disaster risk reduction. So this traditional method will be of this disaster management was abolished, and we adopted for new techniques. So in the today's world, the disaster risk reduction is a key pillar around which every country in the world follow this disaster management system, and it also developed to for the fast and even if you see our look at our Indian natural disaster management policy, we can find this like recently, or if you even analyze the recently disaster management plan which has been approved, so in this plans we have a high importance for the concept of disaster risk reduction plan. So we are completely focused on this one. Now let us discuss about what was the rules or the procedure followed prior to 1994. It's an overview of disaster management before 1994. So let's going on into the topic. So prior to 1994, governments across the world, not only in India, like they have only traditional response to deal with these disasters, and this traditional model focused on only rescuing and relief and providing some medical aid to the victims. So this traditional method was an ad hoc in nature, and it was not comprehensive, not holistic, and as a result it failed to take into account the various parameters which contribute to enhance the disasters. So it was only, in one word we can say, it only concentrated on immediate rescue and relief and providing some medical aid. So in 1990s, what happened, there was a global movement which reformed every government systems across the world, and they definitely had an impact on the field of disaster management as well. If you want to discuss, like this reflected that revolution, worldwide revolution reflected in Yokohama Declaration of 1994. So because of that Yokohama Declaration of 1994, we have adopted a new concept of disaster management that we have discussed the crucial concepts in the before slide, and this was the main what we say main area that needs to be improved still. So first of all, we need to understand what is disaster management cycle, and then we can know how to create a disaster risk reduction plan. So now if we go through this picture, which was downloaded from NDMA website, National Disaster Management Authority. So first step is like prevention. If there is any prediction of the forecast or any forecast of any disaster, they'll be taking preventive steps in order to make sure that that won't create any loss for the people or any human loss. So the second step is mitigation. So they'll be arranging all the things and transportation to vacate that place. And preparedness, we have it is like early warnings during these disasters and when the incident takes place, which I have circled here. So after that, the first step is response from the external sources, from the government, either from any NGOs. We that can be like that. So they'll be helping each and everyone who has faced a problem or faced who are victims of this disaster, and then there will be an immediate relief and rescue operations going on, and there'll be assessment also, like how much value has been destroyed because of that disaster, and then they'll be opting for reconstruction and rehabilitation based upon the assessment of the property damage assessment. So based upon the damage assessment, they'll be calculating the reconstruction and rehabilitation and recovery plan and strategies for the victims who has been affected during this disaster. And this is the overview of this disaster management cycle, and which help us to understand in depth concept of this disaster management, how this works as a response or anything. The phases for disaster has been classified into three types in order to implement different strategies. First one will be pre-disaster phase, and second one will be during disaster phase, and third one will be post-disaster phase. So now we are going to talk about this pre-disaster phase. And this pre-disaster phase largely focuses on capacity building and implementation, and help us in few disasters, from avoiding few disasters taking place. And it will also help us to reduce the risk of that disaster. It in basically it is a procedure, it is a strategy in which we will understand the disaster, that is nothing but hazard. And we'll be calculating the forecasting the risks associated with that. And then we'll be creating a vulnerability map, and based upon that vulnerability map we'll be calculating, or we'll be proceeding further for any capacity building, or what are options left over for us. Like before this measures being implemented, we need to understand the various hazards or the disasters which can affect us, and we need to understand the risk associated with each hazard. And we should also understand vulnerability associated with each hazard. So it is very easy to understand or easy to predict the forecast disaster which will be coming. So they we have to discuss in detail about this pre-disaster phase. And so this pre-disaster phase mainly focuses on capacity building measures, like what measures to be followed to prevent the harm, like what measures to be followed, or what strategy or what technique should be applied in order to be on a safe side, in order to not cause much damage for human life, as well as property, as well as economic damage too. So these are basically a preventive steps in this pre-disaster phases. So this implementing this pre-disaster phase measures or strategies or techniques, or in this kind of method will basically help us to prevent few disasters from taking place. For suppose if there is any low magnitude earthquakes in our locality, so or any high magnitude earthquakes in a particular locality, so what the government does is they inform us in beforehand, so that we can vacate that places in order to save the human life, and in order to continue the human existence. So that is a main concept of this pre-disaster phase. And when we go so this is again the conceptual part of disaster management, which basically takes about understanding the hazards, risk, and vulnerability profile of a country, of a particular country. And vulnerability profile is nothing but it help us to locate the country's map, like where are the disaster prone areas located, and that help us to carry out the rescue operations in those areas. So this helps in this manner. So let us discuss about Yokohama Declaration. So this is a revolutionary change in the modern society in the world, which was adopted by almost all governments of in the world. So this was enacted in the year 1994, this declaration. Before that, all the governments in the world, they only followed traditional approach, or a traditional model, or traditional response to deal with these disasters. See, if we deal these disasters with a traditional model, we can't get sustainability development throughout the whole country. So one part of the country will be much developed, and the other part will be underdeveloped. So in order to prevent this problem, there must be a separate strategy that should be followed throughout the country in order to bring the disaster prone areas to compete with the normal areas too. So the main objective of this Yokohama Declaration is uh, to improvise the strategies that we follow in order to overcome the disasters. So there are two main concepts in this Yokohama Declaration. This Yokohama Declaration introduced the concept of disaster management to the world, not only to our country or any other country, to the world itself. So this brought two crucial concepts in every country of for the disaster management program. So first one is creation of disaster management cycle, the thing which we have discussed earlier with the help of the diagram, that is disaster management cycle. So it basically says when should we opt a different strategy in order to overcome the risk associated with this disasters. And when we see it also broadened the concept of disaster risk reduction. So the concept of disaster risk reduction is nothing but to reduce the risk of that particular disaster to the lowest point. So in the today world, the disaster risk reduction is a key pillar for every disaster management system in the world. So even if you look at the India's national disaster management policy or any other strategies which have recently approved, so they also give a major importance and major concept for this disaster risk reduction. So these two concepts were brought by that Yokohama Declaration, and that is very valuable declaration, very which has changed the entire world for the for to look the perspective to disaster. So that all are related to this Yokohama Declaration. So first of all, we have to know the difference between what is an hazard and what is a disaster. So that, and what is a vulnerability profile also. So that helps in capacity building measures. So let us understand what is this difference between this hazard and a disaster. If we strictly speak, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. All we have is natural hazards like earthquakes, a cyclone, or floods. All these are like hazards. Just it is just a event which is possessing a threat to a community, a set of people. So now the hazard will turn into a disaster when the community is affected by the hazard. So now what, in a simple terms, the hazard will turn into disaster only when there is any loss or any damage to the particular community. So when the community is overwhelmed with a damage which caused, and the community does not have any resources to so cope with the damage, so there this is the where this is where the hazard turns into a disaster. So in the other words, the impact of disaster is basically determined by how vulnerable the community is to a particular hazard. So let us take a basic example which help us to understand the concept in a greater depth. So let us take an example here, the coastal villages on east coast of India. So there is a large problem of any tsunamis or etc because of the weather there and because of the sea situated. So there are largely vulnerable to seasonal cyclones. So the reason that strike the region, so the cyclone event is just an hazard. So it turns into a massive disaster when it occurs or causes very significant damage to the coastal villages. If the cyclone doesn't touch the coastal villages, then that is not called as an disaster. It is just an hazard. The moment hazard touches or creates any significant damage, then we can call that as a disaster. So it causes, when that cyclone touches the village, it causes a huge loss of life and even significant damage to the property and infrastructure and the cyclones which strike the east coast of India. So it can overwhelm the capacity of the local community to cope up with the event. So this is how hazard turns into a disaster. So hazard is just an event, it is just a threat, or this threat will turn into a disaster when causes significant damage to life or property, both, not only life or not only property, for both. So in one word we can say that this hazard, there is no thing that is called as a disaster, everything is natural hazard. So this hazard turns when this results in very significant damage to one speck of people or any other property, then that is called as a disaster. I hope you can segregate what is an hazard and what is a disaster. So now if we are going to take an other topic, which is vulnerability profile. So vulnerability profile is just nothing but hazard map of a country. So it's basically classifies the places of the region, places of the country into the figure into a particular segment, like stating that this part of the country will is having high disaster prone area or low disaster prone area. It basically segregates it a map, uh, basically to understand where this country will be affected, which region of the country will be affected with the disaster or this natural calamities. So vulnerability profile is just an hazard map of a country, classifying country into a different region, and that will categorize them in order to impact these hazards. So this vulnerability profile helps in planning and developing the capacity building and etc. So if you can understand the risk and the vulnerability to the hazard, you can frame capacity building measures to address the risk and vulnerability. So if you can bring down the risk associated with a particular disaster, you are basically reducing the impact of an hazard. So that is the main aim of reducing all these measures, to reduce the impact of the hazard. So if the hazard takes place at an uninhabited area, then that is not a disaster, because we don't have any loss of life or any property, because it is inhabited area generally. So we can only say uh, when the hazard turns into disaster, the simple condition is when it causes a huge loss or a specific loss for any either it may be a human life, either it may be a property, so then that is termed as a disaster. Now we are going to discuss what is a mitigation and what is prevention and what is preparedness. Mitigation is nothing but to reduce the damage or the loss on ongoing disaster, which is presently info like presently we which is presently we are facing the problem with. For example, earthquakes or damage. If there is any earthquake, it causes much damage to the construction, or it causes a loss to public and private property as well. So what we are doing is like just vacating those places, so in order to in order to reduce the human loss, because there we can't do anything other than this saving the human life. We can't protect any building from falling down during the earthquake. We can only do is like saving the human life. So that can be done in this mitigation process. It basically assists the medical and rescue operations during an ongoing disaster. So this mitigation is very important when there is unexpected disasters coming, or which came already. Like we can't predict the nature. We so the heavy raining even results in flooding of particular areas. So that is unexpected. We can't predict the rain, how much rain. We can predict up to certain extent, but beyond that extent we can't do it. So there may be immediate disasters also. In order to save from that immediate disasters, this mitigation process will help us to reduce the human loss and to save and to continue the human race. So the other one is prevention. So prevention can be done for, we can take an example of landslides for this understanding, for greater understanding this prevention process. So that may be, landslides may be man made or natural made, natural disaster. So in order to prevent this landslides, we can prevent this landslides by afforestation. So we can do this afforestation by having this vulnerability profile, that is hazard map. So based upon the impact and based upon the magnitude of the locality, so we can adopt this afforestation process in order to prevent this landslides happening. And like, if we just take an other example of floods, so we can manage that floods. For suppose if we divert the water for any other source, the floods coming into the village or any particular town, that can be reduced easily. So here do uh, we can prevent the flooding of the place by diverting the water to other sources. So this is nothing but prevention is to reduce the impact in order to save the human life. So we are taking early precaution just to prevent, in order to prevent some ongoing happenings in the future. We are right now doing it in order to in order to not happening of that particular disaster, in order to avoid that. So a best example can be taken is the landslide, and doing afforestation for preventing this landslides by using this hazard map or vulnerability profile. So the next is preparedness. So we till now we have discussed about mitigation, and we have discussed about prevention, and now we are discussing preparedness. So all these three things are a part of uh, capacity building management. So preparedness is the last aspect of this capacity building management. So this preparedness is like involving in many methods, adopting many strategies, taking a variety of methods. For example, early warnings and predictions of the weather and weather forecast, which help us to prevent the future disasters. So not prevent the disaster, but to prevent disaster in order to make a loss for us. So there are some accurate predictions of the disasters also. So this preparedness involves in a process where the measures to be taken to prevent the loss will be cited by the government, that is NDRF force, employing them, and they like stationing approximately to the place where the disaster happens. NDRF is nothing but National Disaster Response or Rescue Force, which basically is allotted for this disaster management risk reduction process. So its preparedness is nothing but early warnings. If there is any cyclone in any coast of India, so what the government does is they they send their officials there in order to inform them, so that they can we can avoid human damage or human loss for that particular disaster. So till now we have discussed what precautions to be taken during this pre-disaster phase. So it is nothing but generally understanding the hazard or risk, or understanding the vulnerability, and making the government capacity, increasing the capacity to deal with the disasters. Now we are going to discuss about during disaster phase. So in this phase, the disaster already taken place. So what we have to do, the first step is like local community is already severely affected. So there has been a significant loss to the life, there has been significant loss to the property, there has been loss to the infrastructure, there has been and the resources of the local community has been overwhelmed. and the community here in this situation can't deal with the ongoing disaster. So basically what the community looks in this case is the community will be basically looking for any external assistance, either by the government or any private organization or by NGO. Nothing, there is no specification, but external assistance is nothing but which they receive externally, not from that place. So this is in this event various steps has to be taken by the state government as well as the central government also, because this is during the disaster phase. Already the disaster uh, had taken place. So there are three main steps involved in this during disaster phase. So if we discuss about them, is first one, uh, basically emergency response system will be implied or implemented during this phase, and the first step will be search and rescue operation, and that is also known as SAR operations. And second one will be medical assistance, or and the third one will be food or water shelters providing to the victims. So here what the local government need to be done is like they have to be coordinative, they have to work in coordination with the army or with the NDRF force. So here if there is no coordination we can't do anything. There should be a coordination between state government as well as the district government as well as the central government, so that help us to ensure that no one will be affected, because already the disaster has been taken place. So these are the procedure which we follow uh, during, like, after the disaster taken place. So first step will be search and rescue operations, or for any victims who has been stuck in their house and can't come outside their house or can't come for their rehabilitation center, temporary rehabilitation centers, or if anyone is need of a medical emergency. So that operations will be going on in order to save the elderly people, women, children especially, and physically disabled persons. And the main motive is to bring them back to some temporary rehabilitation center in order to prevent the human loss. And in we have to provide some medical aid to the victims who have suffered a damage in the disaster. And we have to provide the basic necessities, that is food and water and a temporary shelter. So generally this temporary shelters will be done in some government buildings, either schools or hospitals during this phase. Now we are discussing about post disaster phase. We already discussed about pre disaster and during disaster phase, and in this phase we have to take many steps. See, if we look at pre disaster phase or during disaster phase, there are short term techniques applied in that phases, but in post disaster phase we have to apply medium term to long term strategies, because we have to restore everything which has been affected during this disaster. So help is like we have to restore the community to bounce back, so affected community to bounce back to their normal life which was done before this disaster. And we have to restore everything: hospitals, schools, colleges, everything. So this even in this phase we are mainly focusing on affected community for providing their jobs or anything, or even the basic airports or railways there in the place where the disaster happened, and the mobile network even they may be dysfunctioned or malfunctioned there. So we have to immediately restore them in order to provide transportation for the victims or any other persons or for any business activities even. So that air force and railways and mobile network communication uh, should be restored back immediately. And even the houses, or we have to pay even the compensations for the injured or any human loss. And even we have to pay compensation for houses, crops, and livestock also. So for the affected victims in that disaster. And now we are going to discuss about what steps to be taken during this post disaster phase. First step is to damage assessment of damage. We have to first of all do this assessment of the damage in order to make strategies for further. If we know how much damage has been created by the disaster, then we can take the necessary steps in order to bring those back, in order to cover that damage back. So here damage assessment is a most important, a crucial thing during this post disaster phase. And the second one is recovery. We have to recover all those persons who has been displaced during this disaster. And even we have to restore the rehabilitation, and we have to implement reconstruction of those offices or any government sector offices. This is all based upon this this is all based upon the damage assessment. Here damage assessment plays an important role in order to help the affected community to bounce back, because without knowing the damage of that disaster, we can't plan future. We can't plan how much rehabilitation we have to invest in, or what should be done in further. So here damage assessment is mandatory thing. So even the NDRF planning and policies and the structural work by the government and strategies will be implemented during this phase. That implementation will be for mid-term to long-term measures, not for short-term or medium term. So it will be a long, because restoring back everything needs time. So that can be restored in 1 day or 2 days. So it takes 2 or 3 years to restore everything. So this basically this is a part of this disaster risk reduction. So if we talk about what damage will be causing this disaster, is like people may be displaced from one part of to other part. They may be uh, affected because of this floods or everything. They may migrate from one place to another place during these disasters with the help of this government organizations and non-government organizations, NGOs. And what we have to do is like we have to restore the complete livestock of that particular area which was affected during this disaster. So even we have discussed about this airports and railways may be dysfunctioned. So we have to bring them immediately after this disaster ends, within 2 or 3 days maximum, because we have to restore everything. Airports and railways are very important for any place in the country, so we have to restore them we have to give high preference for them. And before that we have to even communication ways such as roadways or anything, we have to even take into consideration of restoring them back as to normal days. And even we have to give compensation for the victims, and we have to give compensation for the loss of the crops and livestock, even the animals, even the animal husbandry there which is followed in that region will be affected during this floods or natural disasters. We have to restore everything back. So the government will be providing compensation for the injured victims and the victims who has passed away during this who has lost their lives during this disaster. And even they'll be providing some compensation for their infrastructural damage, for such as houses or bungalows or etc. So this various plans will be implemented with NDRP planning and NDRA authority, and the central government adopts different strategies also. So the first step after this disaster is like we have to focus on damage assessment of the damage. So without focusing on that key element, we can't move further in order to restore the things or in order to rehabilitate everything. So we have to plan the recovery, and we have to even plan the rehabilitation process, and we have to even plan for reconstruction process, which entirely depends upon this damage assessment. So here for this process, even NDRA, National Disaster Response Authority, will be giving their strategies for the government, and even the structural framework which has been implemented by the central government, by the state government, will also be implemented in that disaster prone areas or in that affected areas, in order to restore them back, in order to restore everything, livestock or quality agriculture or etc, everything. So here assessment of damage is very important term that we have to completely focus on post after the post disaster phase. So now we have discussed pre disaster phase and during disaster phase and post disaster phase. While we compare all these three phases, pre and post, pre and during disaster phase are very short term plans or strategies that are implemented, but whereas this post disaster phase is very important when compared to this pre and during, because it involves in a medium to long term strategies plans to be implemented in order to restore them back. So if we talk about this disaster risk reduction, so this disaster risk reduction plan entirely focuses on, entirely basic basis is based on this reduction of the risk which is concerned with the disaster. So we have three phases, that is a pre, post and during the disaster phase, which come from this strategy of disaster risk reduction. And this entire three process or three phases plan or strategies will be implemented throughout this disaster management cycle, which comes under this disaster risk reduction term. So this is all about disaster risk reduction, which brings everything into force in order to overcome the loss which we have suffered during the disaster of a particular area, in order to restore everything back, in order to restore the human life, in order to restore the uh, livestock, in order to restore the construction process or buildings or the infrastructure which was there. And this all is concerned with this disaster risk reduction. And this disaster risk reduction strategy is implemented throughout this disaster management program, throughout this disaster where the place has been affected with the disaster. uh, we'll be implementing the disaster risk reduction immediately. So in order to get greater greater understanding of this disaster management, we have to focus on knowing this various elements which are involved in this disaster management. First one is risk reduction. So this is involves about hazard analysis and the disaster analysis. Basic knowledge basically involves in the knowledge and awareness generation and capacity building. And when we come to this quick responses, that comes under immediate rescue measures which we have to take during the disaster. And we have to, if we concentrate on recovery, so it is completely based upon the damage assessment, so that we can proceed with further rehabilitation program or reconstruction program basis on that risk assessment. So this is the foundation for disaster management, and this is the basic concept which was involved, basic understanding of disaster management uh, course. So this is the first video. In this video you will be familiarizing with this disaster management. And in the coming up videos we'll be discussing in detail about the strategies, everything. So here, this is the end of the first video, and this is the end of the first course video, and thank you.